What's up guys, in this video I'm going to show you the best settings to get the most cinematic footage out of your DJI Mavic 4 Pro. The Mavic 4 Pro can produce some really incredible results, but if you just use the default settings, you won't be nearly taking advantage of its full potential. And I made a PDF checklist of the settings I'll be sharing in this video, so make sure to check that out. I'll put a link in the description where you can download it for free. So the very first thing you'll want to do is to switch from auto mode into pro mode so that we have full control over the camera settings. So to do that, just tap the little camera icon in the bottom right corner of the screen. And then if you tap on the little camera settings numbers, a box will pop up with most of the settings that we need to change. So the first thing we'll want to set is our exposure settings. Now by default, it will be set to auto exposure, where the drone will control the shutter speed and ISO automatically. And this can work if you're in a hurry, but it's not ideal because you have no control over what settings the drone decides to use. Now, if you do want to go with auto exposure, you can just click on auto by shutter speed or ISO or aperture, and then you'll just adjust the brightness with the EV slider underneath. But most of the time you'll want to have manual control over those settings, so you'll want to disable auto. Now there are three settings that control the exposure: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO controls how sensitive the image sensor is to light, higher is brighter. Shutter speed controls how long the sensor is exposed to light for each frame of the video, and aperture controls how large the opening that lets light into the camera is. So first of all, you'll want to have your ISO set as low as possible for best quality. The higher you go, the more noise and graininess your video will have. In most color modes, you have a base ISO of 100, and you'll want to keep it there most of the time. But with the D-Log color profile, you instead have a base ISO of 400 to give the best dynamic range in log. And so in D-Log, you're going to stay at ISO 400 most of the time. Now the Mavic 4 Pro actually does very well in low light with higher ISOs, at least on the main wide angle camera. So in low light, you can comfortably bump the ISO all the way up to ISO 800 with good quality, and even on up to ISO 3200, you can get a very usable image with just a little post-processing denoising. The 3x and 7x cameras do have a smaller sensor though, so for them you'll want to stay below ISO 800 if at all possible. Moving on to shutter speed, ideally you want to follow what's called the 180-degree shutter rule and set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So for 30 frames per second, that would be 1/60th of a second, because that will give you the most natural motion blur and make your shots look much smoother. But most of the time, setting your shutter speed this low will make your footage look way too bright unless you stop down the aperture all the way, and even then, in bright sun, it'll still be too bright. And so to fix that, you'll need to use ND filters that attach to the camera and cut down the amount of light that comes in. I usually use the Freewell brand of ND filters for this. I haven't been able to get any for the Mavic 4 Pro yet, but I'll put a link to the ones I use down in the description. Now, even if you can't set the shutter speed to exactly double the frame rate, you can still get great shots. You'll just want to be aware that in bright light, you won't be getting proper motion blur. And the 180-degree shutter rule makes the most difference when there's a lot of motion in the shot. For example, if you're flying low and fast or tracking a subject. On the other hand, if you're flying at 400 feet filming a landscape with little to no motion, there's a good chance that there won't be anything moving fast enough to be blurred with a lower shutter speed anyway. And then last but not least, we have aperture. Aperture has relatively minimal effects on how your shot looks, so you can use it to fine-tune the exposure once you have your ISO and shutter speed dialed in. Now the numbers for aperture can be a bit confusing, but really all you need to know is that lower numbers like f2 let in more light and give you a brighter image, and higher numbers like f11 let in less light and give you a darker image. Now there are two effects of aperture that you need to be aware of. First of all, with higher f numbers, you start to lose a little bit of detail and sharpness because of diffraction. Don't ask me all the technical details of it. Basically, the light rays have to bend more as they come into the camera at higher f-stops, and that causes you to lose a bit of detail. f2.0 through f4 are the sharpest apertures, and f5.6 through f11 are slightly softer, with it being most noticeable at f8 through f11. Now, this is a pretty small reduction in sharpness, and I've gotten plenty of great shots at f11, but it's just something to keep in mind, and a good reason to use ND filters for 180-degree shutter speed instead of trying to only use the aperture. The second effect of aperture is that if you have a point light source, like for example the sun or a street light, stopping down to f11 can give you some pretty sun stars. I've mostly seen this effect used used with drones in photography, but it can also be a great effect for video. So now that we have our exposure settings set, we can click over into the second settings tab on the left where we can see all the rest of our settings. So first up, we have white balance, which is basically how warm or cool and how magenta or green the shot is. Now you could just leave this on auto and it will do a decent job a lot of the time, but it can change during a shot, which looks really bad, and occasionally it just simply gets it wrong. So I'd recommend that you turn it off auto and set the white balance manual. It usually works pretty well to just click auto and let it set the white balance manually and then click it back to manual to lock it in. Often that will look decent without any extra adjustment. But if not, if it's sunny, you'll want to set the white balance to around 5600 Kelvin. If it's cloudy, you'll want to set it around 6300. And at sunrise and sunset, I like to have it around 5600 or a little bit higher to make sure I get nice and warm colors. And on the Mavic 4 Pro, there's also a tint adjustment. This is mostly useful if you're shooting under artificial light, for example at night, but you can use it whenever your shot has a green or magenta cast that you want to correct. And then next we have resolution and frame rate. In general, you'll want to set the resolution as high as possible. So on the wide angle camera, that would be 6K, and on the telephoto cameras, that would be 4K. Now you might be wondering, if you're just shooting for YouTube, Instagram, etc., is there really a significant difference between 4K and 6K? And after testing it out, there is a difference. It's not huge, but even with both on a 4K monitor, the 6K footage has more fine detail and looks less crunchy and is more natural than the 4K video. So it's not a huge difference, but given that you can also crop into the 6K video in post and still get 4K quality, I'd recommend shooting in 6K most of the time. And then for frame rate, 24 frames per second is considered the most cinematic. But unless you strictly follow the 180-degree shutter rule and always use a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, your 24 frames per second footage will end up looking jittery and not smooth. So in general, I'd recommend sticking to 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in Europe as your basic frame rate. And you can set it to 60 frames per second for any situations where you might want to slow the footage down. On the Mavic 4 Pro, you can shoot 6K 60 frames per second, and there's really no significant downsides to shooting at 60 frames per second besides the larger file sizes. So I'll often just shoot 6K 60 with a 1/60th of a second shutter speed, just so I can slow it down if I want to. And if you really want to slow things down, you can switch over into slow motion mode and choose 4K 120 frames per second. Now on the wide angle camera, there is a pretty significant crop in 4K 120, so just something to keep in mind. And in general, 120 frames per second is really slow, so unless you have some fast action that you want to slow down, I'd recommend sticking to 60 frames per second. And next we have color profile. Now, unlike most other DJI drones, the Mavic 4 Pro has full D-Log, which is a true log profile that's a lot flatter than D-Log M. And I absolutely love true D-Log. It takes a little bit more work to color grade, but it grades absolutely beautifully and has even more color flexibility than D-Log M. It also has a much softer, more natural highlight roll-off than D-Log M, which makes the image look more like a professional cinema camera than a consumer video camera. The dynamic range is pretty similar between D-Log and D-Log M, but more of that dynamic range is actually usable in D-Log. Because it's a true log profile that's used on high-end drones like the Inspire 3, D-Log also integrates much better into professional color grading workflows, for example using the color space transform tool in DaVinci Resolve, which makes it easier to match to other cameras. All in all, the image that you get with D-Log is absolutely fantastic, so it is my #1 recommendation. But it is very flat and it doesn't look very great when you're shooting even with color display assist turned on. If you want something less flat, you can use D-Log M or Hybrid Log Gamma and still get great results, but you won't be getting quite the full quality of the 4/3 Hasselblad sensor. Now, some people are saying that you actually get higher dynamic range in D-Log M with auto ISO turned on than in D-Log. And turning auto ISO on in D-Log M does give you a boost in dynamic range, but for my testing, while you do get some extra dynamic range in the highlights, the shadows are much noisier than in D-Log, so I don't think the effective dynamic range is much greater if you are really pushing your color grade. But using D-Log M with auto ISO could be a good option to keep in mind if you're shooting directly into the sun. And on the Mavic 4 Pro, even normal profile is pretty good. It's 10-bit, so you have decent color grading flexibility, and for quick shots where you don't want to have to do a lot of color grading, it can work well as well. Now, D-Log, D-Log M, and hybrid log gamma will all need to be color graded to look good, and even normal color profile will benefit a lot from color grading. And so if you want to learn how to color grade your footage, I'll link a video in the description where I explain how I color grade my drone shots. So those are all the settings that we can access from the main camera settings box. Now, one more thing before we dive into the menus is that for the best quality, you'll want to use either the 1x, 2.5x, or 6x zoom settings, which is basically switching between the cameras, because if you go anywhere in between, you're using digital zoom, which will degrade the image quality, and especially on the telecameras will give you terrible quality. And a quick tip, I have the C2 button on my remote mapped to cycle between the cameras on the fly without having to touch the touchscreen. So then diving into the menus, first we'll go to the control tab, and there are a lot of settings here, but we're going to focus on the ones that are important for getting cinematic footage, which are the gain and expo tuning settings. Here we have settings for how the drone responds to your inputs in Cine, normal, and sport modes. For Cine, I just leave all the settings at default. I don't really use Cine that much, and for when I do, the default settings are fine. In normal mode, I have max horizontal ascent and descent speeds all set to the max angular velocity, which is how fast the drone turns, set to 75 degrees a second, yaw smoothness at 15, and braking at 100. And the expo settings I set to 0.25 for up and down, 0.15 for yaw, and 0.2 for pitch and roll. And then under gimbal, I have the max tilt speed set to 15 degrees per second, and tilt smoothness set to 10. And max roll speed is at 10 degrees a second, and roll smoothness is also at 10. And then for sport mode, the max horizontal ascent and descent are all at the max, and then max angular velocity is set to 120 degrees per second, and yaw smoothness is set to 12, and brake sensitivity is again at 100. And then under expo, up and down is set to 0.3, yaw is set to 0.15, and pitch roll is set to 0.25. And under gimbal, max tilt speed is 20 degrees a second, and smoothness is at 15. And max roll speed is at 12 degrees a second, and roll smoothness is at 10. And at the bottom of the gain and expo tuning settings for both normal and sport modes, you'll want to make sure the adaptive camera motion is set to adaptive, not fixed. This slows down how fast the drone turns and how fast the gimbal tilts when you're using the telecameras, and makes it a lot easier to get smooth cinematic movements and track subjects with the 2.5x and 6x cameras. Now, these aren't the only gain and expo settings that can work well. You can do your own testing and figure out what works best for how you fly, but these are the settings that I found to give the best results after a lot of testing. And if you want to learn how to get cinematic drone moves with your Mavic 4 Pro, I'll leave a link to my top 10 drone moves in the description as well. And one more thing, while we're in the control menu, I always keep the tilt angle expansion in portrait mode turned on so I can tilt the gimbal up and down as much as possible when shooting vertical video. And then moving over into the camera tab, a lot of the settings here we've already looked at in the home screen camera settings, but there are a few more settings that we need to change. First of all, you'll want to enable the histogram, which helps you judge your exposure. In short, you want to have the mountain of data sitting in the middle of your histogram, which means you aren't losing data in either the highlights or the shadows. If you have the mountain all bunched up against the right side, it means your exposure is too bright, and if it's all bunched up on the left, it means it's too dark. And then I always have the thirds, grid lines, and center marker turned on. The thirds lines help you compose your shot according to the rule of thirds. Basically, you want to put the important parts of the image, like the horizon or a subject, on one of those horizontal or vertical thirds lines. And the center marker is helpful if you want to precisely center something in the frame, or even just to see exactly where you're headed with the drone. And then one last setting is the sharpness and noise reduction settings under style. The default settings do pretty well. In 6K D-Log, I can't tell any difference with the sharpness at 0 versus -2, but in normal color profile, turning the sharpness and noise reduction down to -2 make the footage look a little less overly crunchy and over sharpened and more cinematic. So there you have my cinematic camera settings for the Mavic 4 Pro. This is actually a condensed version of just one of the lessons in my course. So if you'd like to see more drone video tips like this, check out the Flying Filmmaker course, where I have over 70 tutorials showing in depth how I film cinematic drone videos, edit them together into engaging videos, color grade my footage to give it the cinematic look, and more. And you can check that out at flyingfilmmakerpro.com, or if you aren't ready to dive into the full course, I have a completely free training where I share my top 10 secrets to cinematic drone shots. And of course, links to everything will be in the description. description. And finally, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.